Now, the 60s, well, they're recalled in a series of images. Girls in miniskirts, Beatles record covers. The female face was Jean Shrimpton, ethereal and wistful. The male face was that of her partner in those days, a young man who was born in the East End of London and came to be seen as one of the golden figureheads of that decade. After his first film, Billy Budd, he was called the most beautiful man in the world. His brooding portrayal of Sergeant Troy in Far From the Madding Crowd was the stuff that swoons are made of. Hollywood beckoned. He was set fair. And then he did the unexpected. He turned his back on it all and travelled the world, working occasionally in foreign films, but leaving a question mark. In the late 70s, he appeared to a new generation of cinema-goers as the evil Zod in Superman 1 and 2. And more recently, he's appeared in Oliver Stone's new film, Wall Street. He also started telling his story in 2 books of autobiography, explaining the enigma, unravelling the mystery of a very singular man. Ladies and gentlemen, Terence Stamp. As I said in that introduction there, welcome, by the way.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. That for years, I mean, you were this enigmatic figure. You shunned interviews. You kept yourself away from the publicity. Now you started writing it down, writing the story down. Why?
Well, I didn't really start with the idea of writing an autobiography. I was making a film in America, and my mum died, and I couldn't get home. And I was so saddened by the loss of her that the only way I could deal with, you know, getting up and going to work and keeping myself together was to write down all these memories that were coming back to me. It was as though the sadness of the loss had sort of wiped something clean in my memory, and I had a terrific, strong recall of all the life we'd had together and the things we'd done. And so I just wrote them down. It was a way of kind of keeping myself together, really.
Well, it was therapeutic from that point of view, then.
Yes,
it got you through that period of grief.
Yes, it got me through the film, and when the film finished, the writing ended. It just ended, and it didn't really have a form. I wasn't really thinking about it as a book. It was just something I'd done. And then I showed it to somebody, and they liked it, and they showed it to somebody, and it kind of became a book, you know. It took me by surprise, because once it came out, and then I started getting letters from people saying, what happens next? So then I started work on the next part.
On the second volume, Coming Attractions. Going back, we'll talk about that in a moment, but it seems to me that, as I said, that you re-entered the mainstream of the business that you were in, the film career, when you did Superman 1 in the sort of late 70s. I wonder how much of you accepting that part was due to the fact that Marlon Brando was in the movie.
I hadn't exactly retired, but things had sort of stopped for me at the end of the 60s, you know. I'd stopped getting first division offers, you know, and I was spoiled. I didn't want to go straight down to third division, you know. So I just took off and I did other things. And then I was actually in India when I had this telegram arrive saying, would I come back to London and meet Dick Donner about this movie, and that Brando was going to be in. And that was just irresistible, you know, to be in a film with Marlon. It was...
Why?
Well, because I mean, 2 actors of my generation, there were Brando and there was Dean, you know. They were the 2 idols, and Dean was no longer with us, but Brando was still around. So the idea of, you know, getting up on film with him, albeit brief, was just irresistible.
Was it a letdown working with him, or did it reach expectations?
Well, it wasn't a letdown. He was very different to anything that I'd imagined. He was, well, he's hysterically funny for one thing, and he really doesn't learn the lines. You know, he has them kind of written. He has them written up big behind the lights. You know, so you can't really see he's reading. And in the scene that I did with him, he was. I was, you know, you're waiting to do the scene, and I saw him. He had a little bit of paper, and he was. You're a really disgusting example of a krypton and what he was trying to do, he was trying to learn the first line so that as he turned towards me, he could be speaking before he had it written down. Do you see what I mean? That he was just trying to learn this one line so it looked natural. And I just couldn't believe it, you know. So I went up to him. I said, "Marlon, you know, what are you doing?" So I'm trying to learn this line, you know, before. And I said, "But how are you going to play Lear and Macbeth, you know, if you can't learn a line, you know?" And he said, "I've learnt them already." Just not a moment's pause. You know.
What was the best advice you've been, looking back on your career, you've ever been offered by another actor yourself about your craft?
Very early on, I was actually sort of trying to prepare myself to go to drama school. So I was making that transition from being a non-theatrical person to a theatrical person, and so even meeting, you know, seeing another actor was a big thrill. And one morning on the Underground, I found myself sitting opposite an actor called Wilfrid Lawson.
Oh yes, wonderful old actor. For
actors, I mean, Wilfrid Lawson was the great actor. You know, he was bar none. He was just the mesmerizing guy. And I was just so fascinated by him, and he was a great drinker as well. Wilfrid was sort of looking at me, and I was looking at Wilfrid, and he was smiling. And finally, I summoned up, you know, frightened that he'd get off the train. I said to him, "Excuse me, sir, you know, I'm trying to be an actor, and is there any advice you could give me? Is there any advice you could give me about acting, you know?" And I said, "Well, what do you do?" And he said, "I learn the wordies."
Learn the wordies. It's wonderful, isn't it?
And at the time, I was just mystified by that. But in fact, as I got older and as I got deeper into the business, it was a very considerable piece of advice, because in truth, if you do just that, when you get out there, something happens.
What's curious and interesting about your career is whatever gave you the notion. There you were, born in the East End of London, poor upbringing, poor from the financial point of view. Your father was a tugboat pilot. No sense or idea of show business in your family. What gave you the idea you were going to be an actor?
I suppose my life was... once I was sent to school, my life kind of ended. You know, my boyhood ended when I was sent to school. It was so awful to have to go to school every day. And the idea that this was going to be my life for the next 10 years was appalling, really. And so I didn't think too much about my life. The only thing I thought about was going to the pictures, because that was the wonder, you know. That was Technicolor. That was just heaven to be in the movies. And I suppose in the beginning, the whole thing about being an actor wasn't about being an actor. It was just about being Robin Hood and being Captain Blood, you know. And then as I got older, I realized that they weren't really, they were really Errol Flynn and they were really Gary Cooper. And so I kind of transferred to them that I knew I couldn't be like them, but that was an ideal.
What about the women in the movies? I mean, did you fantasize about them?
Yes,
Yeah. Which ones particularly? I was Madame Vera Huber-Ralston. Oh, not many people have heard of her.
No, I missed her.
You missed her. I'm a bit older than you.
I had a terrific thing about Jean Simmons in Great Expectations.
Did you?
You know, she played the young thing in this crinoline. And Jean Tierney.
Oh, I shared that one.
Was a definite dry throat.
Palpitation and a dry throat, yeah. That's as far as you got in those days, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, you know, Rita Hayworth and...
Well, you met Rita Hayworth, of course, didn't you?
I did. I phoned her up.
Did you? What happened?
Well, I mean, I just heard Rita Hayworth was in London, and I thought, well, I'm famous, you know. I'm famous as well, you know. And she's an older woman. She'll understand, you know. So I found out where she was, and I rang her. And I said, hi, you know, I'm Terence Stamp, and you're in London, so I'd like to take you out to tea. She said, sure. Sure. Come round to the hotel. So I went round to the hotel. We had tea. And I wasn't as overwhelmingly confident as I thought I'd be, you know, with my newfound fame. But I did manage to, you know, ask her for another date. So what about dinner, you think we'd have a bit of dinner? She said, sure. We went out to dinner, but the thing was that I was kind of expecting her, because she was the beloved and I was the lover, I was expecting her to kind of take the initiative, you know, which of course she didn't. So.
It's that end, right? What about, let's go back to the 60s now, because in the book, Forthcoming Attractions, you've got a very strong sense of period there, and I mean, I remember the 60s. Well, it's strange, and if you live through that period, you feel part of a kind of a history, don't you? I mean, your kids look at you and think, oh, you knew the Beatles. I mean, you were there when it all happened, the miniskirt and all that sort of bit. You, of course, I mean, were part of that legend, weren't you? Because you had this association in those days with another young struggling actor called Michael Caine. He was very much your teacher, wasn't he, in those days?
Yeah, sure. The great Caine, you know. Yeah. Taught me all I knew.
About what?
About everything.
Really?
Sure. But he was a great philosopher, wasn't he, Michael?
Yes, yes.
What he didn't know about something, he made up.
He's still doing it.
And he's so convincing that you don't... I mean, I still do things that I haven't questioned that Mike Caine told me, you know, because he was so confident telling me.
Yes.
But, yeah, and he was, you see, when I met him, I was 20, and he was 26, and I was doing my first job. And he'd been in the business for 6 years. So he was very much more mature. And our meeting came at a time when we were being sort of besieged by great actors from the North, you know. Finney and O'Toole. And Mike just felt that, you know, somehow to be a Cockney was second class. You know, he didn't feel that, but that was how the business felt. So when he sort of realised that I was a real EastEnder, he was just delighted. You know, it was as though he found a worthy sort of pupil in a way, and it was a very practical kind of tuition about, you know, what to do when you're out there. And then later on, when the tour finished, he kind of took me up, like I became his mate. And then he'd show me the provinces, and then he started showing me his London, and he opened a kind of a wonderful world for me.
Billy Budd, of course, was the big break, wasn't it? That was the thing that started you off. Then there was Peter Ustinov who directed that film.
That's right.
How did you get the part? Did Ustinov spot you? I mean, was it by chance or what?
Well, I mean, looking back on it, I can see an extraordinary, sort of precise movement of destiny, really, because I was actually rehearsing a play, my agent, I got a message to call my agent, and I called him, you know, at the end of the day I called him, and he said, oh, you know, I want you to go, I'm so glad you called, you've got a 6 o'clock meeting in Golden Square with Peter Ustinov, and it's for Billy Budd, and you've got to be there, and, you know, make yourself as smart as you can. I said, man, you know, which part? And he said, well, it's Billy Budd. And I said, don't be daft, you know. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I can't play Billy Budd. He's a sort of angel, you know. He's an angel. I can't play that. I said, they must be really scraping the barrel, you know. And my agent said, they are. They've seen every young actor in London. You're the last one. And in fact, when I got there, I looked up and I saw Ustinov looking out of a top floor window. He wasn't looking at me. He was just sort of looking out over the rooftops, and I was so... And I'd felt confident up until then, because I knew I couldn't get it. Mm. So I was totally confident, you know, I had nothing to lose. And then when I saw him, the idea of meeting this guy, this kind of genius, you know, made me very, very nervous. And when I got in to see him, he was so powerful that everything that I said seemed to just float, seemed very thin. And I just stopped speaking. And to all intent and purposes, I just blew it as I sat there like gormless, you know. And later on, Peter told me that what he'd been looking for was he'd been looking for a quality that Billy Budd has, that the way it manifests is that when he's faced with anything he doesn't understand, because he's so angelic, if he's faced, for example, with evil or greed or something, he becomes bereft of speech. He can't speak. He just can't speak. You know, he has a stutter, but he just... And so the more gormless I became, the more enamoured he became of me.
That, of course, was the start of that so extraordinary phase in your career, when you became, as I said, this one of the Godhead figures of the 60s, the face of the 60s. You were taken in by society, lionised by society. How did the East End boy sort of take to parties and consorted by toffs and people like that?
What happened in the 60s, really, was that when the 60s first happened, I thought it had happened to me, because I became famous at the birth of the 60s, and my life changed completely. It took a while to realize it was cosmic, you know, that was happening to everybody. All these kind of young people were famous, you know, famous hairdressers, famous tailors, famous actors, and most of them were working class. So there was a kind of reverse snobbery, really.
Yes, your own aristocracy.
Yeah, suddenly all these years that I'd worked trying to perfect my English so I could speak like somebody on the wireless, that all stopped. The lessons stopped immediately. You know, I went straight back to heavy plaster. You know.
And what about this other thing too? The tag that you got, the most beautiful man in the world. I mean, imagine you sitting there now, that wonderful tag in a flat in London in the 60s, waiting for Brigitte to ring. Did she ever ring?
Well, I did meet her.
You did?
But on the morning that I awoke and I was famous, and the phone rang, I did think it was going to be her. And it was my mum.
Oh, she said, come round and have a cup of tea.
She was, oh, have you seen the papers? You know, oh, look, you're all over the papers. And I thought, why isn't it BB? Hasn't BB seen the papers? It wasn't till about 68 that I actually met her. And then I was sorry, you know, that I hadn't mastered the old French at school, you know.
But the point was, in fact, that the phone never did ring, that was the illusory part of fame that you discovered very quickly.
Yeah, I discovered it that morning, you know, when it wasn't BB, you know, and the whole day passed and it wasn't BB, you know, or anybody else, you know, and I thought, my God, it's all a myth, you know, I can't believe it.
We'll take a break there. We'll be back to tell some more of the story in just a moment. See you then. Welcome back. Terence, there you are. You're in the 60s now. You go to Hollywood. Everything seems to be set fair. Nothing to stop you becoming this huge international film star with Gene Shrimpton. I mean, the two of you, the faces of the 60s. And then all of a sudden, you turn your back on it. You go away. Why was that? What happened?
Well, I suppose two things happened, really. It seemed that my career ran out of steam. I just, you know, the wonderful offers stopped coming. And I think it was just fashion, really, you know. And then my sort of romance with Shrimpton ended. And I had to really question all my values, and which I hadn't done. I mean, they were values that I formed as a boy. And as a fairly morose kind of kid, I'd always thought that if I could become rich, you know, instead of being poor, if I could become famous instead of being absolutely unknown, and if I could meet the perfect partner, then my life would be all right. Not much, you ask. And in my case, it just all happened, you know. It was as though somebody said, right, he gets all his wishes of today, you know. And then when I broke up with Gene, which sort of coincided with, you know, the end of the 60s for me, there wasn't any distraction. There wasn't the distraction of work. There wasn't distraction of other romances, you know, I was just sort of hurt. And I started thinking, it's really not true, you know. It's really not true about all that. That didn't give me, it didn't give me a kind of permanent happiness, you know, like it was supposed to. I mean, I'd read it in Woman's Own, you know what I mean? You know, they just end when they go off and live happily ever after, don't they? They never go on to anything more. And I had always wanted to travel. And I had a few bob, you know. So I thought, well, I'll do it now. And I bought a round-the-world ticket. And I didn't give myself any kind of date to come back, really. Mm. And I must tell you that I didn't anticipate that this, the lull in my career would be quite so long. I didn't think it was going to be 10 years out of work. You know?
Well, it wasn't 10 years out of work.
It wasn't actually out of work.
No, I mean, you made films in Italy. I mean,
yes, I mean, but when... It was just when I ran out of bread, when I seriously ran out of bread, then I'd call my long-suffering agent in London and say, what have you got? And he'd dish up some terrible crap somewhere, and I'd go and do it, you know?
But I mean, in among all that crap, I mean, there were one or two worthwhile moments. I mean, you worked, for instance, with Fellini.
Yeah, I consider that like before the lull, you know? I mean, it was, I mean, I worked for Fellini in '67, and then immediately afterwards I worked with Pasolini. And it was after Pasolini that I took off, you know. Mm. There are some sort of events in your life that you can never forget. And, of course, Billy Budd was one, but almost the second one was working with Fellini.
Why?
Well, because before working with Fellini, the job of acting had always been fear, and that fear, it's a kind of groundless fear. It's something to do with, you know, not being able to deliver when the film's turning, you know, and you live with that. Something you get to live with, and in a funny way, you get to depend on it. And when I went to Rome to work with Fellini, during the filming, I realized that I was waking up laughing, you know, and it had gone. Mm. And it was something to do with, you know, being chosen by the man who was one of the very top guys in the world, you know, albeit second choice. I mean, he
Why? Who do you want, first of all?
Well, he'd been sort of accosted by O'Toole in a restaurant. and apparently he was having lunch, and O'Toole had seen him, and, you know, he'd had a few, and he went into the kitchen and got on a waiter's outfit and came out with Fellini's lobster bisque, and immediately stumbled and tipped it over some total stranger. And Fellini, of course, who sees everything, saw O'Toole like, sorry, darling, you know, wiping the, you know, really terrible moment. And Fellini had seen it and remembered it. And of course, O'Toole had said, I want to work with you, you're the best, let's do something together. And when Fellini was approached about this odd length film, it was like one of three, it was one of those curious trilogies they made in the 60s, an Edgar Allan Poe story called Don't Wager Your Head with the Devil. And he remembered this great actor, you know, under the weather, making a fool of himself. And so he adapted the story so that the lead character was a great classical, washed-up English actor, tempted to come to Rome to make a Western financed by the Catholic Church by promise of a convertible Ferrari. That was Fellini's adaptation of the Poe story. And of course he was talking to O'Toole, and O'Toole was saying, great, darling, great, terrific, great, you know. And then he sent him the script. Then silence. And then about a week before shooting, he suddenly got this call in the middle of the night saying, it's O'Toole, I'm a sod, you're gonna hate me, I don't want to do your movie. So Fellini was really sort of left in the lurch and phoned to London, some casting director he knew, and said, send me your most decadent actors. And I just made a Western, and my hair was baby blonde, you know, but dark roots, and I was wearing bells and stuff like that. And he loved me. He loved me, and he just and of course I had to love him, which is not hard, you know.
Mm. But I mean, you look good now. You're what? You're 50 now, are you?
Nearly.
Nearly 50.
Smile when you say that, Mike.
Smile? No. You look wonderful. I mean, you really do. And I mean, are you very conscious of the way you look?
I'm getting less conscious, you know. When the fame thing happened for me, what also happened was that what I was, which was plain, or not exceptional, became the fashion. It does funny things to your head. And it messed my head up in that I felt that there were kind of no bounds, you know. And I suppose I felt like a kind of an irresistible young woman, you know. I mean, there are certain women that are just irresistible to any normal guy, you know, any sane guy. Could not resist, like BB or somebody. I mean, you'd be crazy to resist BB. You know? And all that happened was that I had these few years where I was really sort of, I was sort of Jack the Lad, and I thought I was Jack the Lad as well, you know. And then the fashion started changing, and I started aging. Not really aging, but from my standpoint, aging, you know, and I often felt that Yeah, that when I noticed that I no longer had the attention of kind of across the board, you know, like sixth formers didn't turn around in the street anymore.
Their mums probably did.
You know, nowadays, when I'm on movies, you know, actresses come up to me and they say, "Oh, you're Terence Stamp." I say, "True, true." They say, "My mum loves you." My mum.
I get grannies. What are you worried about?
That I doubt. That I doubt.
But I mean, that's a very sort of almost a sort of feminine assessment, isn't it? That's how women feel about their looks. I mean,
I guess that's how women feel. Yeah. And I think that showbiz people, you know, showbiz men are more prone to that because you think if you're a leading man, then you're never quite sure whether how much is your ability or how much is your looks. You know?
let's now look at I mean, it'll be the point, you're now in another interesting phase of your career now. I mean, you're back making movies, and you're making one or two very good movies too. I mean, Wall Street, which is a new film by Oliver Stone. You just had a cameo part in. First of all, before we see the film, tell us what's the part you play in the movie.
My briefing, I mean, Oliver Stone just called me, and I was very flattered because, you know, this was the guy who'd made Platoon. And he said, "Terence," I said, "Yeah." He said, "God, well, you know, I saw you in The Hit, and I think you were terrific, and I've written this part in my new movie. It's called Wall Street, and you're exactly right, you know." And I said, "Well, what do you want?" He said, "Well, you know, I want a kind of Jimmy Goldsmith. That's what I want. Can you play Jimmy Goldsmith?" I said, "You've come to the right man." and then when I got there, he said, I said, "Okay." Well, he said, "Well, you know, you're." I said, "Well, I've researched Goldsmith, you know." And he said, "Well, it doesn't have to be Goldsmith, you know. It can be, you know, it can be John Daly or Putnam or Murdoch, you know, any of those billionaire megalomaniacs, you know, any of them." He said, "You know, you're just a self-made, you know, you've come up from the gutter and you've self-made and you've become an aristocrat and you're like a gent." I said, "Doddle." So that was what I gave. And this Sir Lawrence Wildman.
Sir Lawrence Wildman, and opposite you in this scene is Michael Douglas.
Mike Douglas.
Okay, so the clip we're going to see now, it's a confrontation between Terence Stamp and Michael Douglas in the film. It's called Wall Street. You got good reviews for that film in America particularly. Might you be tempted to Hollywood yet again? Might this time you succumb?
Yeah, it's, you know, really it's the place where they're making movies, you know, it's what I'm interested in, really, films, yeah.
And what about the writing, Terence? I mean, you've got the second volume, Coming Attractions, out now, in the new book. I mean, there's that, and that takes up the point where you actually make Billy Budd.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the story's not even half over yet, is it?
I guess it was like a three-part thing, you know. I feel that I have to kind of tell about how it was in the 60s, you know, and I'd like to write that. I don't feel that I can kind of rely on it. I don't really think of myself as a writer. I don't know that I would be able to go on to, you know, other things, you know, novels and stuff. It's wonderful to be able to do it. I mean, I'd love to be able to make movies and scribble, you know, but I'm not sure about that.
One of the questions you must ask yourself as you go back through the life and investigate where you came from is that old saying, you know, you can take the boy out the East End, but can you take the East End out the boy? And I mean, what conclusions have you reached about that, about yourself? I mean, how much of the East End kid is still there?
I think it's a working class thing, in the sense that if you have an upbringing that's hard, and you naturally do without, it gives you a kind of grit somehow. Kids are born to wealth. They, you know, that to be without is an unknown, and I find that it's unknowns that are fearful. And I think in that sense, you can't take the East End out of the boy.
And finally, again, looking back over your life, have you ever thought about, had you not chosen to be an actor, what you might have been?
Yeah,
What?
yeah. I thought, a jewel thief.
You think so?
Yes, one in black, you know, coming in up the drain pipe, you know, while people are asleep, you know.
Oh, I know that one. It's with the girl in bed and the chocolates. Is that the one?
Yeah,
That
something
one.
like that, yeah.
Well, thank you for being my guest. I've enjoyed that very much. You also enjoyed the book, Coming Attraction. All the best with that, and the movie, and the rest of your career. Terence Stamp, thank you very much indeed. Terence Stamp. So that's it. That's all we have time for. We'll see you at the same time next week. Until then, from all of us here, very good night. Good night.